What I would like to do is just start with a couple of the questions that have come through from those that are with us remotely, in order to give them the opportunity to take part a little bit more. So, first one that we have is in respect of the Early Learning and Childcare Programme, where, sounds like a planner here, certainly. Are the local authorities going to get additional funding for delivering that Early Learning and Childcare Programme? I think that's for you, Alistair.
Thank you. The First Minister made an announcement in her closing address at the SNP Party Conference in relation to additional monies that will be made available to support the expansion programme. At this point in time, we are working with local authorities to understand the implications of that for their plans going forward.
Okay, I also have that same question, just to give Stefano a fright, for Stefano to answer. Where do you see there being facilities like that appearing within an infrastructure levy? Would it be taking on board things like the early years and childcare policy?
Yes, that is potential infrastructure to be included. As part of the research and our recommendation, as I said in the presentation, it is to cover as wide a range, if not the full range of infrastructure, which would include early learning facilities, etc.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any questions from the room, or will I go on to what I have on my post-it notes here? Okay. Further one here is the timing could be an issue with that infrastructure fund. Obviously, as you were explaining, Stefano, that it is a long-term approach that we're looking at. And there was a question about, could local authorities borrow with it being determined, because obviously that funding, as you were saying, wouldn't come through until the end of a process. Is there a role, just to put Alistair on the hop, for the SFT to cover the debt and the risk of councils borrowing that funding up front? I don't know if that is your area of expertise, Alistair, so please just say if it isn't.
I'll pass on that one. As I mentioned previously, there has been an announcement in terms of the funding that will be available to support the programme, and we'll be working with local authorities to understand how that can support their investment plans going forward.
Stefano, what do you...
Yes, you're absolutely right to say that there is a leading time for this infrastructure levy. That could be in the order of 4 to 5 years before the actual funds generated through the levy would be available. And we do acknowledge and recognise in the research that there may be a need for some pump priming, and that pump priming could be potentially borrowing against the kind of forecasts, returns or expectations from that levy. So the mechanism that we've suggested doesn't prejudice that from coming forward. So there is the potential of borrowing and pump priming infrastructure off the prospect of levy funds coming forward in the future. Interestingly, I think in the SIL example, there are restrictions in terms of borrowing against that. Again, that would need to be kind of carefully considered in terms of how that would apply to an infrastructure charging mechanism here in Scotland.
That's what I was going to come in and say as well, that I get nervous, and hopefully you all do as well, when we actually talk about borrowing money long term for something that might happen some way down the line. If you look at and think back to the very first chart that I showed you, the extent to which debt is actually increasing, I think we should all be concerned that we are actually talking about a format, a mechanism which actually relies on borrowing. I think we should be looking, and this is right across public services, not just infrastructure levy, but additional, different, more innovative, maybe more thought-provoking mechanisms which actually ensure that we're borrowing less or not borrowing at all, or reconsidering how we're using our existing resources at the moment. So the prescriptive format for borrowing within local authorities is called the Prudential Framework, Prudential Code. I will not bore you with the detail. And there are certain criteria against which you'll be assessed and judged. Based on what we heard already, I don't think that would enable borrowing to actually take place. It would have to be affordable, it would have to be prudent, and have to deliver everything. So I think it would be very, very difficult perhaps for borrowing to be justified. That said, I mean, there can be opt-outs, there can be specific government regulations, legislation which allows borrowing under certain circumstances to take place. But I hope, if I've got nothing else across to you today, it's the consequences of borrowing. Just about all of our economy is actually going to be wrapped up in borrowing, government borrowing at the moment.
Okay, so we have a challenge there on perhaps what our thinking has, the direction that our thinking has been moving into. I'll pass over. We have a question from. Thank you. If you can.
I was just intrigued with the slight differences in emphasis, where most of these presentations are coming and emphasising the long-term aspects of doing a long-term plan, and you would financially plan accordingly, you know. But I'm just always intrigued by the dichotomy of how local government finance seems to operate, where it seems to be on mainly, correct me if I'm wrong, on an annual basis, and that's why they get their budget. So there seems to be an inherent friction between reality of what we get and how we can achieve things which we aspire to in the long term.
Don?
I think that tension is there. It's always been there. I get no sense that tension will disappear. I think there's a number of things at play here. I think that we have the issues associated with the Scottish budget, which has to take place on an annual basis. And once that budget has been determined, then there is the release of funding or the notification of funding to local authorities, which actually puts in place the characteristics of what appears to be short-termism. And that graphic I showed you of the £9.5 billion, and that's generally announced early December-ish, early December, something like that, for the funding year starting April next year. So at this stage, local government does not know the level of funding it will actually get. That sounds bad. Yeah, boo, we could say. However, that doesn't stop local authorities making or having to get involved in long-term decisions in any event. As soon as a child is born, he or she will be educated and expect to be educated, and the local authority will expect to educate that child all the way up to he or she is 18. And there'll be care packages being decided probably this week, which will be for the long rather than the short term. So I think that this disconnect, or apparent disconnect, between what seems to be short-termism, but the need and the ability to make long-term decisions, I don't think is as difficult as it needs to be. We still borrow for the long term as local authorities and make these long-term decisions. The biggest factor, I think, is on the political spectrum. And I don't know if there's any politicians leading into this, but politicians and politics necessarily is short-term, because we have a long-term view of what finance, local authority, infrastructure and local authority services should look like. Brings tension with the short-term nature of the electoral cycle, which is every few years. And it's essential for our elected politicians, perhaps understandably, to be able to demonstrate progress over that short period of time, rather than actually think of the long period. So you're right to draw attention to I think that tension, but I don't think it has to be as big a factor as we actually think it is. I don't see that necessarily getting in the way of long-term planning, of long-term thinking.
Okay, Stefano?
Absolutely agree with what Don was saying there. I think there's the two issues. There's the political cycle and the long-term planning. As planners, we are we are educated to be visionary and think long term. The planning review seeks to address some of these issues in relation to the planning, the political cycle, by making LDPs, local development plans, consider a longer term, which will hopefully mitigate against any kind of political kind of tensions. But we'll have to wait and see on that one. And in terms of long-term planning, from an infrastructure perspective, a number of the infrastructure bodies already plan in a long-term way with 5-year plus plans themselves. So I think one of the key things about the infrastructure levy is that it's a mechanism by which the relevant parties involved in infrastructure can come together in a collaborative partnership way and share each other's long-term plans in a coordinated strategic infrastructure document.
Thank you. Alistair, do you have anything you want to finish up or input on this morning?
Just to pick up on the question that was raised there, it's one of the issues that the Scottish Government has recognised, that local authorities certainly would benefit in having visibility of the longer term funding to enable them to plan the new services that will be required as part of the expansion programme, and that is something that will be developed over the next few weeks and months in terms of giving local authorities hopefully better visibility to enable them to start that process.
Okay, can I at that point stop and thank you all very much for your contributions this morning. Don, Alistair, Stefano has given us a very good context and has ended us with an appropriate point of looking at long-term, how do we achieve a more long-term approach where that is possible. What we'll be going on to do now is just spend the next 20 minutes with the handout that's been put in front of you during that coffee break, which will be asking you to have a look at questions and give us a little bit of your thoughts on the infrastructure levy and that long-term approach and how that could work for you. But prior to that, can I ask you just if we could thank all our speakers from this morning.